I'll give it a few minutes for folks to come into the meeting room. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Kathy King, International Vice President, speaking to you from Los Angeles today. I'm a member of the Los Angeles chapter. On behalf of Dr. Sheila Harris, who's president of LAI and the International Board, I'm honored to welcome our members from around the globe and their guests. We know that our 29 chapter cities are experiencing this particular phase of the pandemic in different ways. Some are reopening now and others are facing even greater challenges, but we wish everyone well, complete with full vaccinations. And thank you to everyone for joining us today for the third in our Color of Law series. Looking back, what began as a means to support our chapters with programming during the pandemic has become a very relevant, new, broader perspective. And LAI International is planning to continue delivering global programs to our chapters. Also, as many of you know, LAI turned 90 during the pandemic. And as part of our anniversary project, we're making every effort to weave our history as an organization into the global programming. And you'll be seeing pieces of that as we continue forward. And we also, in our previous programs throughout this past year, have been showing you our new video, which we call 100 Faces of LAI. And we invite you to take a look at that on our website. So today's program was inspired by the book club of our Minnesota chapter and The Color of Law, written by Richard Rothstein. The Global Programs Committee, in concert with Land Economics Foundation, developed the series around several themes from The Color of Law. In the previous two webinars in this series, we looked at the intersection of land economics and equal justice, as well as our public housing legacy. We invite you to see these recorded webinars from January and April on LAI TV, otherwise known as LAI YouTube. In today's program, we will look forward through the lens of raised awareness with questions about remedies in connection to land economics. Our speakers, led by Nick Koch, will spotlight stories from different cities, two of our chapter cities, Austin, Texas, and St. Paul, Minnesota. We want to extend a super big thank you to the LAI Global Programs Committee, Richard Koch, chair, who hails from the Vancouver chapter, and also to Christine Williams, who's LAI's historian from the Chicago chapter, for all that they've done to just really create substantive programming. Today, as far as our program administration, we're going to ask you to be patient. We will be answering questions after the program, but we invite you to post your questions in the chat box throughout the program. Anytime you have a question, please feel free to jot it down and we'll be picking those up after the program. And then also, I have a favor to ask. If there's anyone who's interested, we're looking for a volunteer from our audience who's interested in taking notes today and who would also be willing to work with our communications chapter, or I'm sorry, communications committee to develop a program that will be published in our LAI keynotes. We really appreciate any interest in that. So without further ado, I actually have another announcement. Is that we previously advertised in for today's program that there would be 3 cities, projects from 3 cities, but unfortunately, Robin Rue Simmons, who was going to talk to us about Evanston, was unable to make the program. So we're going to move forward with the other 2 cities. I would like to introduce Nick Koch. Nick has been a member of the Lambda Alpha International since his hair was brown, and he served on the Twin Cities chapter board through several administrations as president. He's recently retired from HGA Architects and Engineers, which has been supporting a project called Reconnect Rondo, which we're going to hear a lot about. Nick is a graduate of Harvard College with a concentration in visual and environmental studies. Nick worked hands-on for several years in building restoration, which inspired him to go into architecture. He credits the University of Illinois School of Architecture for getting him away from his native New England, and Garrison Keillor for the move to Minnesota. We love NPR, don't we? For several years, he has been helping St. Paul's Rondo community in their effort to reconnect their neighborhood that was severed by freeway construction in the 1960s, which is his connection to today's topic. Thank you, Nick, and we look forward to today's program.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And in the sequence, our actually first speaker is going to be Heyden Black Walker, who I'm going to introduce right now. I'm so glad that she's speaking because she has created something called Reconnect Austin. And so I'm thinking that reconnection is a real theme here on so many levels. Heyden is the Director of Planning at Black and Verneuil, and it's their legacy is in community design, urban design, and community advocacy. I think that's the hat she's going to be wearing a lot today. One of her interests is that she'll be talking about is this idea of something happening with transit in downtown Austin. She cares strongly about equity in transportation. She's worked on the Pedestrian Advisory Council. She's a member of the Congress of New Urbanism and served as a planning commissioner for many years. Without any further ado, Heyden, why don't you get us going on your topic?
Thank you, Nick. I appreciate that introduction. So I'm Heyden Black Walker. I'm going to share my screen really quick. And as Nick said, get us going here. I work for an architecture and urban design firm called Black and Verneuil. So we always show a lot of slides because I'm not a designer, but everybody else in the office is. So can everybody see the screen okay? All right, so I'm going to jump right in. I am the Director of Planning at Black and Verneuil. I also am the Chair of the Board for what we call Reconnect Austin. And I'm going to talk more about Reconnect in a minute, but first I want to deal with really structural racism and how it applies to the highways we built all across this country. I do want to thank Lee Einsweiler from Code Studio, who is a friend and colleague, and suggested or connected me to you guys. I had not heard of LAI before, so it's exciting to be here, and I'm glad to be here with you today. So Richard Rosslin's book is just so powerful, and I love the thesis that I don't think anyone had ever really talked about before, that we didn't segregate our communities really voluntarily, as is often assumed, but our communities were segregated intentionally, but with city and state and local policies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how that happened in Austin, but really the story is similar and sometimes identical in most cities across the country. And I did include the link, in case you haven't seen it, to a video that Richard Rothstein and a local videographer from Austin actually made together. If you haven't had time to read the whole book, the video at, I think, 16 minutes is a little bit more accessible. So I understand you guys are geographers. So I wanted to start with the original grid for Austin. In the middle, I hope you can see my cursor. This is the Colorado River. Congress Avenue went up to the original Capitol. It does look different today. On the west side of the city was West Avenue, and on the east side was East Avenue. Not super creative, but that's what they were called. West Avenue still exists, but East Avenue does not, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So in 1928, Austin, like many cities, unfortunately had a plan that forced anyone who was Black to move to a special 6-mile district. Before then, after emancipation, and I guess I should take a second to recognize that tomorrow is Juneteenth, which started in Texas. It took 2.5 years after emancipation for word to reach Texas. and it reached Galveston on June 19th. And so that's celebrated as Juneteenth. And I'm so pleased to see that President Biden signed into law that Juneteenth is now a federal holiday. And so since that's tomorrow, I wanted to recognize that. So this plan in 1928 basically said if your skin was Black, even if you lived all over the city, there were 15 freedmen's communities in Austin. All of those people were forced into one 6-mile square district if they wanted to receive city services. They were refused city services otherwise. And then, so this is just for reference, this is East Austin again. This is our capital, Congress Avenue, the river, but this red is East Austin. So I know you guys have already talked some about redlining. In the 1930s, surveyors were sent in to most medium and large American cities, redlined East Austin, which was of course already a primarily minority community. So surveyors, if you're more interested in this topic, the EPA has been doing some really interesting research and webinars. Redline communities tend to have more concrete, be hotter, have fewer trees, have a lot more industrial kinds of uses. And those are just a few of the impacts. And so property values were intentionally depressed. People couldn't get mortgages or insurance. And then, so this is what East Avenue used to look like. It was a broad boulevard. And to your left on the screen is what was East Austin, where Black families were forced to move. And this is just, I think this is a fascinating picture. Houston College faced onto East Avenue. And this is a picture of the historically Black college. This is a picture of their graduation ceremony when East Avenue still existed. And then one of the things I think is really fascinating, and a hat tip to Reconnect Rondo, they've been dealing with this too and kind of highlighting this. When we decided to build I-35 out of East Avenue, and I'm going to talk more about that in a minute, a lot of these Black families were stripped of their generational wealth. They used eminent domain to buy these properties. A lot of the properties were sold for less than $1 a square foot. Those properties now nearby are worth over $1,000 a square foot. Austin's growing rapidly and property values are shooting up. So, you know, and if you look at where the highway was placed, you can see on this old aerial from the 1950s, early 50s, this is East Avenue still existing. And then we superimposed the right-of-way of the existing I-35. And you can see that really no land was taken on the west side, on the downtown side, and all of the land that was eminent domain was taken from these minority communities who had already been forced into this area and then had their land taken away to build the highway, and really walled off. And Rothstein talks about that, how highways were often used as a way to wall off communities to make sure they didn't spread out into other parts of the city. And it became this, I-35, which is what we have today. And if you think about what happens in these communities, you know, the highway is very dangerous. It's a barrier. It prevents people from, I don't know why that happened. It prevents people from accessing the city and jobs. It's very hard for transit to get across, so it makes transportation difficult across the highway. It also, you know, highways were built to prioritize a sort of traditional office worker who wanted to live in the suburbs and get back to the city quickly. So it prioritizes that trip, but it really impacts the people who live next to these highways. There's a lot of air pollution. People who live next to highways have shorter lifespans, higher incidence of asthma, lung cancer, all kinds of horrible things. These things are very loud. I've stood next to this highway with a sound meter. It can be 90 decibels or above from the traffic. And you get a lot of water that's polluted running off as well. So lest you think that we are past this, I just wanted to note that in Houston, the Texas Department of Transportation, TxDOT, is proposing a widening of I-45. It's very similar to the project I'm going to talk about in a minute in Austin. And with that project, which goes through primarily Black and Hispanic communities, they intend to demolish over 1,000 houses, 344 businesses, 5 places of worship, and 2 schools. And the design of the highway would put another 26 schools within 500 feet of the widened highway. And then I'm not going to read through them, but you can see on the screen are examples of things that fall under that business category, but are community services that serve that population that will also be bulldozed or heavily impacted. Okay, so I want to switch over and talk about just highways in general for a minute, now that we've talked a little bit about the racist history, and highlight what's going on in Austin. So this is the Katy Freeway in Houston. The Katy Freeway was widened to 26 lanes. You can see it from space. It cost almost $3 billion to widen it, and TxDOT is actually proposing to widen it again. And congestion got worse, which I know is counterintuitive, but that's what happens with highways. When you widen them, more people decide to use them. They make a different choice. And so if you're interested in that topic, Transportation for America did this amazing report called the Congestion Con that takes Federal Highway Administration data, looks at it over 100 cities in 24 years, and finds that in every case where highway lane miles were added, even in cities that lost population, congestion got worse. So, and I'll just note, I think it's really important to recognize that during COVID stay home orders, we actually solved congestion. We know from years and years of data that widening highways will not solve congestion, but we keep doing it. Whereas we showed that when you change demand, we can actually solve congestion. So these are pictures from Austin. On the left is I-35 frontage road, and on the right is 2nd Street, which is a very economically productive street in Austin. And what we find is that highways also depress property values. You see that people are using the land for things like parking lots and parking garages because the land is not very valuable. There are a lot of impacts from the highway. And when you look at Congress Avenue, which I showed you earlier, the land along that street is worth 6 times what it is 5 blocks away along I-35. And then we also think a lot about, the land that we give up. Like this is Barcelona. There are hundreds of thousands of people living in here. There's shops. There's a lot of productive economic activity going on. And this is the highway interchange at exactly the same scale. And there's a lot going on here, but this is just to say from the river to Airport Boulevard, which is a little over 3 miles and is the section of highway that we're talking about, there's 136 acres in highway right-of-way that we could be considering how to use differently. We propose that it should be used as an urban boulevard. This is one of the great boulevards of the world, the Passage de Gracia in Barcelona, and it carries buses, it has trees, it has parking, wide sidewalks, bike lanes, and it's connected back into the city. So it carries a lot of traffic, but it also serves a lot of purposes of the city, which is a purpose of the city is really economic and social exchange, and you don't get that in a highway corridor. So what Reconnect Austin is, and I'll just say it, I think you're right, Nick, that Reconnect is really a theme. We came up with Reconnect Austin before we ever knew about Reconnect Rondo, but this concept of reconnecting the city across these barriers is, I think, really critical. So we propose to put the highway lanes below ground. It's just basically a big ditch. You cover it with what's called a cap or a lid. And then that lid can become a boulevard. And so then you connect all of those east-west streets, and where these, I'll just say, because sometimes people don't really understand, where these buildings sit are now frontage roads that pay no taxes to the city of Austin. So recently, the Congress for the New Urbanism, the national office, put out their Freeways Without Futures report. It comes out every 2 years, and I-35 was named as one of those freeways without futures. So if you compare this vision with what TxDOT intends to do, for nearly $5 billion, there would be no capping at all, no additional connections east-west to connect the city back together. The frontage roads would remain. And, you know, yes, it would be lowered, which would help and give us future opportunities, but it would be a giant canyon right through the heart of our city. So we say this is really easy. If only it was as easy as Photoshop. Here's standing downtown on 5th Street, looking toward the highway as it exists today. This is with it gone, and this is with development where you wouldn't even know there was a highway down below. And this is just graphically showing all of those potential connections through downtown, most of which don't exist today. We really essentially reconnect that original grid that I showed you earlier. So, you know, there are a lot of good things going on in downtown Austin. It's a very rapidly growing city. This corridor is Waller Creek, which would be a green corridor that connects the University of Texas up here to our downtown and Lady Bird Lake. And I-35 is as close as half a mile from this corridor. So we think the opportunity is just pretty amazing. And then I just want to close with the thought that, and I'll show you a couple of pictures in a second, but these projects are happening all over the country and all over the world. There's a state group in Texas that meets together. There's now a national group that's meeting together. These projects are happening more and more rapidly, and it's not really a question of whether they can be engineered. It's a question of whether there's political will. We know how to do them. They're being done all over the place. So this is the Woodall Rogers Freeway in Dallas, which was actually built as a depressed freeway originally. This is right next to downtown in the Museum District. It connects downtown to Uptown, which ironically is one of their original freedmen communities. It was capped with a 5-acre park. And I want to point out that the public improvement district that was created around this before it was capped over 6 years has more than doubled in property values. The return on investment here is enormous. And this is just one example, but it happens to be in Texas, so we use it a lot because sometimes TxDOT says, oh, you can't cap a freeway. And we say, well, you did in Dallas. So, and it's a beautiful space. Walking through this park, you would never know, and most children don't realize there's a highway down underneath them that connects all the museum spaces and makes for a great play area. It's a really wonderful space. So I'll stop there. There's probably more to say, and I'm happy to answer questions in a little bit, but just wanted to give you an overview. I will say, and I want to be clear, I don't have any great solutions for what happens if the highway were capped downtown. It would obviously have an enormous economic impact on both downtown and East Austin and the University of Texas and the neighborhoods to the north that would be reconnected. And while that's a really exciting vision, there are people who are worried about that. They're worried about what it does to their property values and the development that might come and the displacement that might happen. In Texas, we have very, very few tools to prevent that. So there's been a lot of discussion of things like community development corporations and land trusts, but I'm afraid I don't have any solutions for that. I just want to be upfront that that's a really thorny issue with these projects and something that's going to have to be solved. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Heyden. That was great. My friends, I'm going to start, and I'm getting some technical help from Sheila Hamilton because things didn't go quite so well today. Sheila, would you be kind enough to bring up the Reconnect Rondo website? Thank you. Folks, I'm going to do something a little bit unusual. And first, I'm going to ask if the link to this website can be put in the chat. And then I'm going to ask Sheila to scroll down just a little bit more. Stop right there, thank you. And you will see on your screen a spot with a video. It says PBS and it's black. I'd like to draw your attention to that. And I'd like to ask that after this program is over, that you copy or capture or somehow preserve, and maybe LAI can email all these links to you later, since we know that chat links tend to disappear. I'd like to ask you to please watch this 9-minute video because it tells you more on a human empathy level than I could do in 9 hours. And I'm not going to be talking all that much about the bridge. I'm going to be talking about LAI's heart of land economics and connect that to human factors, because let's face it, economic value still stems from human value. And I want to acknowledge and appreciate my colleagues in the Minnesota chapter, especially our president, Peter Brown, for getting us going on this whole program of the color of law. And I want to thank LAI International for grabbing this and running with it. It's really been wonderful. In the last year, our chapter has addressed topics on gentrification, justice-built communities, redlining and racial covenants, and it's been really important work. And now I'm going to ask guests, thank you, Sheila, to bring up these slides. And I want to talk a little bit about this. And it is appropriate, this notion that Heyden said about today is actually the official celebration of Juneteenth, the first federal holiday since Martin Luther King in the 1980s. Tomorrow is the calendar day. Today is the federal holiday. And folks, I am talking to you from my 100-year-old house, 2.5 miles away from where George Floyd was murdered, and about 6.5 miles away from this community called Rondo. And I need to quickly mention that this was once Native American land, and we acknowledge that here. And actually, the folks in Rondo are very aware of this and are addressing these topics in their planning. So the historic Rondo land stems back to 1858, and it was 40 acres set aside by a guy named Joseph Rondo. But something happened. And could I have the next slide, please? Those of you who know Minnesota know that we think of ourselves as a great liberal place, great quality of life. But if you look at the right half of this slide, you'll see it's not so great if you are a person of color. Just look at those numbers. And then, of course, there's been the human side with the racial tensions, so many of which were playing out last summer. And unfortunately, it was more folks than just George Floyd. Could I have the next slide, please? So in the 1950s, there was an intentional decision made to build a freeway. And I'd like you to notice, please, that headline that it was intentional. And I'd like you to please notice that there were, in fact, 2 routes that could have been taken. The northern route, which was advocated for by the city planner of St. Paul, would have gone along a rail corridor, industrial land, and been completely out of the way of any neighborhood at all. They didn't make that choice. Instead, they followed this red-orange line. It happens to be a lot straighter. And the area was once called a slum by the city demographer in the 1930s, and that made it an easy choice. But here's the thing, it was no kind of slum. Could I please have the next slide? In that video that I referenced, that I'd be very grateful if you watched, you see the human story of what happened in Rondo. You'll see a man about my age lamenting the loss of the home of his grandparents, and his grandfather was a minister. You will see the present day spiritual leader of Reconnect Rondo, a man of dignity, intelligence, a retired attorney, a graduate of Morehouse College, getting emotional about the human impact and the hurt and the loss. And this has been measured with very detailed studies on home values, home ownership rates. Please notice, half of the homes were lost and more than half of the population. But what these metrics don't show is the human and social impact, because the networks, the human networks and the businesses and the social structures that kept this neighborhood together, that made it a vital middle-class neighborhood with dances and people and barber shops and human interactions and people knowing each other, that was rent asunder. And fortunately, the good people working on this have, for the benefit of the analysts and bean counters, they have quantified these losses of intergenerational wealth. They have drawn connections to the opportunity loss, the college educations which could have occurred from this, and they have calculated a loss of equity. So this isn't just about a bridge. This is about healing a community to which a huge injustice was done. I draw your attention to this path to healing, and I want you to know that these great people back in the 80s, 40 years ago, started a celebration, started real small, it's become real big, to remember who they were and where they came from. There's an annual festival, annual parade. Every year it grows better. And the idea for reconnecting, putting one of these caps on, which is why I'm wearing this, arose in the earlier part of this century. And I want you to know that there were apologies, formal public apologies made by the former mayor of St. Paul and by the director of, at the time, of the Minnesota Department of Transportation, great guy named Charlie Zelli. And these folks stepped up and they recognized that a wrong had been done. A commemorative plaza was built a few years later, and then the formal initiative of Reconnect Rondo was launched 4 years ago. Next slide, please. What matters in this slide is not the small data. What matters is, and it's available on their website, the rigorous economic and human analysis of the impact of this wrong and the degree of thinking to create a new future. Next slide, please. So this photo is apt because you see on the right contemporary time and on the left an older time. And I want to tell you, this is about rebuilding a community and the values that have been lost. Next slide. So it is way more than a bridge. So the organization is calling it a restorative movement, and they are looking at all these dimensions, and every single colored square here is receiving focus, rigor, discipline, and is being addressed to make this all better. So it's way more than just a lid. Next slide, please. So here are some dear friends. The man on the left is Marvin Anderson. He is known as Mr. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. He is beloved by all, and he's just our guiding light. Keith Baker is the executive director. He has worked in MnDOT. He's been a consultant, and he brings an engineer's discipline and analysis to the program. And you'll see a list of good people, all from the neighborhood. Next slide, please. So here's an image done by some of my former colleagues of what they hope to put on this bridge. And it's not just a park like in Dallas. And as a matter of fact, what's on the bridge is the essence of what they're going to try and recreate, to knit together a community. And of course, the idea is that this healing of development and reconstruction will extend on either side of the bridge back into the original neighborhood. Next, please. The semicircle of icons here talk about the concepts that they are applying to rebuilding this community. Housing, open space, education, culture, addressing the environmental injustices that have been done. And there, all these domains of practice are being considered. Next slide, please. So, you know, you don't need to read the details, but you need to understand the takeaway of, again, the rigor of thought, the alignment of community members, the alignment of political support. Right now, the group is in the blue box in the middle. They have done extensive feasibility studies on every dimension that you can possibly want to measure and think through. And a planning initiative is currently underway. And I'm hoping about a year or two from now, maybe we can come back and tell you what happened. So this notion of a purposeful journey that they've articulated. Next slide, please. So I do want to acknowledge a fellow organization, the Urban Land Institute. And who knows, I should say that some LAI members and past chapter presidents are engaged in our chapter in helping out here. Again, phasing, there has been a phase 1 study that was supported by the Urban Lands Institute 3 years ago, and there is one going on now. Next slide, please. This slide demonstrates both the scale of the initiative. You'll see it's larger than the park in Dallas. You'll see that it extends over many city blocks, and you'll see the idea is to be able to reweave the neighborhoods on either side of the freeway. And you will see a lot of big dollars in the left-hand column. These reflect the rigor and the approach and thoughtfulness that have been applied. It's actually the pre-planning was really the most important thing. You know, that old phrase, well begun is halfway done. They've been working on community engagement, analysis, environmental review. This step that they're calling organization and ecosystem capacity building is receiving a great deal of attention. And you'll notice that they have planned in the notion of anti-displacement. A little gentrification, especially if you're an owner, is a good thing, but they want to protect it because half the housing ownership is gone. So who's going to benefit through all these improvements? And then the rest is just good old-fashioned design and construction. Next slide, please. This, you know, you could strike out economics from here and you could put human opportunities, because they're talking about housing and innovative approaches of net zero, modular, new ways of thinking and programming housing, workforce development, cultural institutions being brought in. Next slide, please. So here's a picture of, you know, the image of the hope and the optimism and the sense of restored justice and community with land use impact and economic impact, but really righting a terrible wrong that was done in the past. Next slide, please. Application of precedence. The folks engaged in this organization have been looking at land bridges all across America. They've been looking at the development covenants, the processes of engagement, the lessons that can be learned, because let's face it, this has been around for a while. And they are looking at this as a means of not only doing it again, but creating a model which can be adapted for other sites across the country, because there are many of these. On the right, you'll see this notion of some recent projects in Minneapolis and St. Paul, which have received lots of funding at all kinds of levels of government, county and city and federal, and understanding where the public benefit flows and how this can be directed and channeled for economic growth and human recovery. Next slide, please. Again, I know you can't read this and you always hear people say, oh, I know you can't see these letters. I just want to assure you that the thoughtfulness and the rigor and the compassion and the intelligence has been applied through all these steps, and actually all 5 of these steps: establishing a team, beginning master planning, increasing consciousness, partnerships, impact. This is all happening as we speak. Next slide, please. Funding. Right now, we are working on funding and a 3P, 4P approach. Please look at these 3 bullet points underneath this. And again, I will credit the folks at the Urban Land Institute, because the second funding grant has gone into supporting these efforts. And it's tied into equity and ownership and shared resources. It's truly inspiring. Next slide, please. I am going to have, next slide, please. I will have a very exciting link to place for you in just a few minutes, which will, I think, inspire all of you. So I want you to capture this and copy this. They have built a network of human infrastructure that goes from the kids in the schools to the folks in the city, to the folks at the county level, to the governor's office. And I saw just a few days ago, United States Senator Tina Smith in a conversation with Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg talking about infrastructure and healing. People at every level have come in, and I guess I'm sounding like a cheerleader, aren't I? Next slide, please. Thank you. Now I'm going to ask Addie Walker, could you please load into the chat that link I sent you about the PBS NewsHour and the coverage that these folks got in late May of 2021. I just want people to get that. I want to ask people to click on that, to cut and paste all these links and resources. I hope I haven't gotten too excited, but this just moves me in a way. Now that I'm retired, I'm doing some of the most important work of my life. I know that this aligns with Lambda Alpha ethic and sense of values, and I thank you for your attention. Tip my hat. Should we do some questions, and shall I look at them in the chat, or how are we going to do this? I guess I'll click on the chat and see if there are questions. I'm going to have to scroll back. I so wish we were in the same room and could have talked to each other in person and done some real human reconnection. As I scroll back in the chat, my friends, I want to again thank Addie Walker and Sheila Hamilton for dropping in all these very useful links. And I hope, Sheila, that maybe you can email them to the attendees. That would be just great. The New York Times article that came out about, was it 2 weeks ago? That's a great national story and gives you the national perspective. I still implore you to click on that Reconnect Rondo link and hear the testimony of Mr. Anderson, which is so great. So, Kathy King,
Good.
would you like to articulate what you wrote, since you can?
Well, I noticed that there were a couple questions or comments related to federal infrastructure. Christine Williams asked the same thing. And the question was, and I'll ask Heyden to answer, because she provided a quick answer to those of us as panelists. But the question is, with the recent passage of federal funding for infrastructure, should the opportunity to reinvent transportation corridors to reconnect communities be woven into these projects? And it'd be great if that could be a priority for actually selecting projects for transportation grants.
And
Right.
okay.
Sorry.
Is Hayden supposed to answer this, or what do you want us to do, Kathy?
Well, I noticed that Heyden, she started to give a quick answer
Okay.
in the chat box. So Heyden, you wanted to go ahead and maybe elaborate a little bit more on that?
Right. So there are several proposals on the table, and I apologize, I don't get them all straight. I don't do a whole lot with federal funding, but there has been a lot of discussion, especially from Pete Buttigieg, who's now Secretary of Transportation, about funding these kinds of projects. And at least at one time, there was $20 billion that could go to DOTs, but could also go to cities or even nonprofit groups like Reconnect Austin and Reconnect Rondo to help make these projects happen, either through the like to either pay, I'm sorry, for like planning and design and community engagement, or potentially even construction, although these projects are wildly expensive, so they tend to suck up a lot of funding. So I think it's really exciting to hear the Secretary talking about this so frequently, and I think it's really changing the dialogue. I wrote in the chat to the panelists, my fear in Texas at least is that that may not come soon enough. This is a federal highway, but the Federal Highway Administration has been very hands-off, and TxDOT has a long history of not really listening to communities. They are trying to do better, but there's a pretty big gap. They have a long way to go. And really, at least in Texas, from our DOT's perspective, their responsibility is throughput, is pushing as many cars and trucks as they can through the city. So right now, I-35 through downtown in the University of Texas is 12 lanes. They want to increase it to 20. And they will tell you, they will admit that they know that that won't solve congestion, but that's the premise of the project. And so we have this once in a lifetime opportunity, right? They're going to come in and tear out the entire highway for 8 miles. And we have an opportunity to reconfigure it in a way that benefits the city more. But that's been a really difficult conversation. And while I'm talking, I'll just say, because I kind of touched on it, I see a question in the chat about community engagement. That has happened to a certain extent. It's been, I think, a little bit confusing for people. TxDOT has done some community engagement, but they throw out these big complicated plans and then they give the public 30 days to respond, which I don't think is enough. I mean, if you think about if you're a neighborhood group and you are just finding out about the project and seeing the plans, how do you call a meeting and learn what's going on and build consensus and respond in a meaningful way in 30 days? It's really virtually impossible. And many people in the community, thousands, have asked TxDOT for longer and they will not give it to us. They keep saying, we have a project to deliver, stop asking us for more time. And then the Urban Land Institute came to Austin a little over a year ago in February of 2020, invited by our downtown public improvement district, the Downtown Austin Alliance. And they did an amazing process, and ULI had some really great recommendations. And one of those recommendations was to set up a scoping working group of community members. And that scoping working group is called Our Future 35. There's a website for that, actually, if you wanted to go look at it. There are over 50 community organizations represented there, most of them from organizations in East Austin with people of color. And even that has been, all of the recommendations made from that scoping working group have also been ignored by TxDOT. So, it's just, the whole thing is really difficult and frustrating. I hate to be such a negative person, but my hope is that these are happening more and more frequently across the country. We're having a dialogue, we're understanding the racist history, and we're trying to figure out what to do about it, which does give me hope.
Yeah.
And I offer a few thoughts for fun. And actually, it occurred to me I should share, and we should wind up with something a little bit humorous. So I've brought this prop, and I'm going to explain why I did that. In terms of the other questions about funding sources, Minnesota is the land of 10,000 lakes, 10,000 choirs, and 10,000 community organizations. And I'm very happy to say that the city, the county, which is Ramsey County, and the federal government are all talking together. And I'm happy to say that the grandfather of the current mayor of St. Paul happens to be from the Rondo neighborhood. And the mother of the current mayor of St. Paul happens to be a Ramsey County commissioner. And yes, we're all talking together, and I'm really hoping there have been presentations at the legislature. I know that our member of Congress, Betty McCollum, is engaged, and I think up and down the ladder of hierarchy, I'm pretty sure everybody's connected. Now, I should probably explain why I held this up. Do you all remember way back when, 3 years ago, there was this rage called Pokemon Go? Do you all remember that? Well, some of my colleagues developed an app that mirrors the Pokemon Go functionality. And it is geotagged and place-based, and it ties to this bridge because you can go with your phone, you can click on a QR code, you can hold your phone up and look at the Freeway trench, and you can see ghosted on top of there possibilities for development. So you can look at the whole and you can look at the potential future. And this same app, and this is really something beautiful about community outreach, is tied to other tablets and devices where community members and governors can type in their feedback. It's time-stamped, date-stamped, linked to a person, and it goes to a central website where all this community input can be gathered live. You don't have to go to a community meeting at 7:00 p.m. when you already worked a long day. It can be taken to a nursing home or a hospital or a school, and it's very accessible. So pretty exciting stuff. And just to conclude, I'd like to invite all of you. I'm just going to hold this up for fun here. This is an invitation because tomorrow at the Rondo Commemorative Plaza on the actual Juneteenth day, our Mr. Anderson is speaking. A historic honeysuckle tree from the community is being planted, something old. Something new is being planted, a Carter family tree, that's the mayor. The lieutenant governor, and who's a Native American person, and the governor are all coming to a 1-hour celebration on the commemorative plaza, part of the outreach strategy. Okay,
Hey,
thank
Nick.
you.
Hey, Nick, a couple of folks have actually asked how they can contact you.
Oh, okay, well, I can say it and then I can type it in the chat. And this is a small joke. Since my retirement email is my first and last name with a V 2.0, like version 2.0. So it's right there. You can see the Nick Koch on the screen in the little window, and then put a V and the number 2.0 @gmail.com. Yes.
Great.
Now, should we give people back? Oh, thank you for whoever typed this. That was very thoughtful of you, Sheila.
Hey, let me check
Can we
here.
give them back some minutes or?
I'm so excited. We have another question. In Vancouver, Canada, we have recently voted to remove an elevated expressway. While it has many social goals, it is also spurred by the prospect of increased land values while still moving people efficiently. Is there a positive benefit cost purely on economic opportunity to these two projects presented today, related, how do you see us overcoming resistance to the high public front-end costs? Would either be?
Yeah, I'd bring in a LAI member who's a economic analyst and development projection person. Actually, I know this is being done by the group already through strategies of whether it's the city is looking at making a special district to capture the old-fashioned TIF. Beyond that, finance is not my sweet spot. I'm so sorry, folks.
Finance is not mine either, but I'll just put a general call out there. If anyone wants to help us with that, our little grassroots team of community leaders would love the help. You know, that's a huge question. So just in downtown Austin, just the first mile of this project, which is essentially what you see behind me, you know, those buildings are sitting on what are today frontage roads that pay no tax at all because they're owned by the state. And so we calculated that if you narrow the footprint so that there's a boulevard and the highways below, that's 30 acres just in downtown Austin that could be developed. And that 30 acres, if you calculate, so we're architects, so we calculated out like perimeter block buildings with some point towers. So you get housing for 7,000 residents, people who may have been displaced originally from East Austin and who want to live close to jobs downtown, plus millions of square feet of offices and retail. And we calculated out the taxable value at $3.2 billion. Now that's a lot of revenue just on the tax, on the property values, plus then you would have probably hotel motel taxes and liquor taxes and sales taxes and all sorts of things that generate income for the city and the state. And in Texas, at least, the problem is, I saw a question about Vancouver. I think Canada is better about cities being able to kind of manage their own destinies. In Texas, you know, we're dealing with a highway department that's solely focused on a highway widening, and we can't really seem to get traction of the idea that it would be economically beneficial to all of our jurisdictions to think about a more efficient way to use that land. So yeah, we are not economists either, but I think that that's a point that is going to be really important. And to me, it's probably the key to making a different political decision at some point, I would hope.
We have a comment just came in from Peter Brown. It will be very helpful if Fed level Secretary Pete Buttigieg promotes this reconnection ethic over just moving cars. It's real infrastructure. And that was what I meant in my comment about setting priorities. So, you know, really being thoughtful about the priorities for granting projects. And I also, you know, in working as a county parks planning director at one time, was really engaged in responding to 4F. You know, doing the 4F responses. And I can't help but think that, you know, the wheels of government don't always move really fast. So hopefully, Heyden, you know, it's not too late. And then, you know, technically the process is so complex that hopefully, you know, more than just the 30-day response limit, there's these other processes that the federal government has to go through, where it would be really great if the regulations could be adjusted so that factors like this, reconnecting the community, are deliberate, you know, and have to be addressed with the 4F and other processes.
Yeah, absolutely. And we didn't really even talk about climate change. You know, you can look at any city in the country and see where the highways were placed in the 50s and 60s based on the red line maps. And those red line communities are the ones that are facing this most severe effects from climate change. Why would we induce, you know, more car trips that produce more pollution, that increase climate change? You know, you know, it's kind of like trying to steer the Titanic. You know, we have to make a different set of choices, and we just haven't really been willing to do that yet.
Great.
Hey, Kathy, you were a great host. Thank you, Heyden. I'm sure we just wish everybody the very best. And thank you, Sheila, for running the technology. what would you like to do now? Do you want to close us out with a bang, Kathy?
All right, yeah, it could be a bang. Sheila, is there anything you think that we should add? We're actually wrapping up right on time.
Right on time. It was like we planned it this way.
Mhm, yeah.
It was a
Thank
real
you,
pleasure to
everybody.
be here.
Good
Thank you so much.
execution. Thank you so much to Nick and Heyden for a very inspiring talk. I really learned so much. Thank you.
And the
Thanks for
video
the
is-
opportunity.
The video will be
Bye.
posted on YouTube, and I have saved the chat, and we will be sending out the link along with the all the new web links.
Yeah.
Okay.
Tune into LAI TV.
Yeah. Amen. And thank you. We're doing good work. This helps the greater cause. Thank you, Lambda Alpha.
Thank you. Thank you.